In contouring, or global dodge and burn as some people like to call it, our objective is to add definition and dimension to the face and the features. The tools we'll be using are just two curves, and these will be set up the exact same way that we set up the two curves for local dodge and burn. I'm going to do this setup by running an action simply because they are exactly the same. As you can see, they are also raised and or lowered by half a square, just like the local dodge and burn curves. Now I would highly recommend though to keep these contouring layers separate from the local dodge and burn layers because you might want to change them independently. There's nothing worse than going too heavy on your contouring and wanting to dial it back, but not being able to because they're on these same adjustment layers as local dodge and burn. So one of the questions that I hear very frequently is whether or not the contouring should be applied with the assist on, and I would not recommend it. The problem is that it is very difficult to gauge the intensity of the adjustments that we're making here if we're seeing it with the assist on. So we also cannot really gauge how natural and realistic our contouring is looking. Now, if you're having a hard time figuring out if your contouring is smooth enough, you can toggle this assist on and off once in a while, but again, I wouldn't keep it on for doing any actual work. Alright, I'm ready to get started. I'm going to split the contouring into large scale depth on the face overall and then small scale definition on the features. Let's start with the large scale depth. I'm going to start with the shadow or the burn, and I'm going to dial in my brush settings. Actually, they are already dialed in. I'm just going to keep them the same as I have them on local dodge and burn, which is 1% flow and 100% opacity. Generally, if you're running into issues of your contour coming on patchy or too strong, you'll notice it's because you've bumped up your flow too high. When you're first starting out, you might even want to dial back your opacity to 50% if you still feel like 1% flow and 100% opacity is too strong. But I feel like this is a pretty good balance to be working at. Okay, so we're going to start applying the shadow around the perimeters of the face. The most important thing here is to keep the full face in frame so that we see it as a whole and see the relationship of the features to each other. And we want to adhere to the pre-existing shapes of the face. Contouring is all about exaggerating what is already there, the existing shapes and the existing lighting. We want to make someone look like the best version of themselves. We don't want to make them look like someone else. So, here I'm going to identify where we already have shadows based on the lighting. And once again, this is something that the assist is good to temporarily toggle on for. So in this case, we can see pretty clearly that our lighting source is coming from the right-hand side and slightly from above. We can see this because the shadows are falling on the left-hand side and the bottom of her face and her features too. And also a dead giveaway is going to be the catch light, which as you can see is in the right-hand top side. So what that means is that we are going to want to emphasize these shadows a little bit more and not add as much shadow on the right-hand side of her face, as that's once again the direction the lighting is coming from. So let's get started on some of these large-scale shadows. We have them on the left side of the temple, and I'm just feathering this on with a very large brush. We also have a shadow running across the left side of her face here, and under her cheekbone, and sort of around her jaw, and then the bottom of her jaw. Once again, working with a very large brush here. So if we take a look at this mask by pressing and holding Alt or Option, you can see how soft and feathered this mask really is. If you come in with anything, less feathered, then you're probably going to start seeing the edges of it, especially, if you turn on your assist. This should apply very smoothly, and it shouldn't mess with any of those transitions that we spent so much time cleaning up in the local dodge and burn. So let's continue to apply this. Now we've applied it to the left side and the bottom side of her face, and we can also apply it a little bit to the nose, around the left side of the nose and under the nose. And then we can work on the right side of the face, and as I mentioned, here we want to be a little bit more subtle because that's the side that the light is coming from. Still, we'll go around the same shapes, around the right edge of the face, and then the jaw, and a little bit of the forehead. In regards to the shape of the contour on the side of the face, I find it easiest to picture it as, we can use blue maybe, as a 3 and a reverse 3. So it kind of starts on the forehead and then goes under the cheekbone and then does its bottom half around the jaw. Same thing on the other side. This is of course a reverse 3 and kind of comes through like that. That's where you will mostly find the natural shadows on people's faces. However, of course, each face is slightly different. Here's what I have so far. As you can see, it is a little bit heavier on the shadow side and a little bit more subtle on the light side. Now I'm also going to add the same contour onto the side of the nose and again keep it a little bit more subtle on this side. So this is the before and after for the contour so far. Before and after. Before, after. Very gentle, and I do like to check myself by taking a look at the mask. It's very soft. And we can also turn on the assist and toggle that on and off and make sure that it applies smoothly and doesn't create any new disruptions or transition problems. So let's go ahead and do the same thing on the highlight side of things. Once again, we can turn on our assist to see where the brightest highlight points are, and they're going to be towards the center of the face, of course. So, our brightest highlight is this cheek up here, and a little bit of a milder highlight on the other cheek, on the forehead, the center of the nose, and of course, sort of the chin. So let's go ahead and emphasize those with a very large and soft brush. Going to carefully paint this onto the center of the cheek, the center of the forehead, really just focusing on the brightest points and feathering it outwards from there. Same thing on the other side, feathering it from there. A little bit on the nose, although that's very bright already, and a little bit on the chin, which we don't want to go too heavy on because generally in women we don't super want to emphasize anything around the jawline as that's considered a more masculine feature. So here's the before and the after for the highlight. This is super subtle. As you can see, very gentle. In other scenarios I might go heavier on this, but here the highlights are already very bright and I don't want to start losing detail in them. So in this case I've done more burn work than dodge work. Here's the overall before and after for the contouring so far. Here's the before and the after. Okay, let's move on to feature definition. This is my favorite part of the entire workflow. Suhail calls this gloss, so this chapter is dedicated to Suhail. This detail definition, just like the large-scale depth, should adhere to pre-existing shapes. So if you don't have pre-existing highlights, it's going to be very difficult to create heavy gloss from scratch. It's probably not going to look natural. So once again, adhere to what is already there. So let's get started with the eyes and try to identify a couple of specular highlights. Specular highlights are the most reflective highlights. So for example, these little guys, this one, this is technically a specular highlight. Just the highly reflective bits of the skin and the eyes. So even some of these here, or underneath the eye, we have a couple. So those very bright highlights, those are ones that we want to look out for, and those are the ones that we'll be emphasizing in this step. For this kind of work, I like to dial my flow to 10% instead of 1%, and that's just going to speed this up a little bit, and we're working with a very small precision brush. So let's get started, for example, with these inner specular highlights that are on the tear duct. I'm just going to emphasize these with the highlight, and I'm also going to lightly emphasize some of the less noticeable highlights. Then we can move over here to this one. We can strengthen that as well. And of course, we can emphasize the large catch light in the eyes. I also like to bring a little bit of light into the iris on the bottom half of the iris and on the side that is opposite of the catch light, so in this case the left side. So bottom left side, I'm just going to feather this on very gently with a larger feathered brush. So here's the highlight so far, before and after. Okay, let's move on to some of the other highlights around the eye. So right up here. And as you can see, I'm working with a small detail brush for the first pass of these, just to really bring in that detailed definition. Down here, I'm going to do the same thing, just kind of keeping a bit of a random painting pattern to keep that sort of textured feel to it, instead of just, just scaling in like this. Over here, we're going to do the same thing. Again, I'm going to keep a fairly small brush and emphasize these highest highlights. Same over here. Anywhere around the inner corner, generally light is pretty flattering, and then around the outer corner, shadow is going to be more flattering. So this is the before and after of our highlight so far. As you can see, it has already brought a lot of definition to the eyes. I'm going to dial this back to 5% and also add a little bit more large scale highlights, so just a little bit here, a little bit on the brow bone, some right on this lash line, just because there's already highlight here, otherwise I wouldn't add any, and then some on the inner corners of the eyes. So right around there. Okay, so here's our final before and after for the highlight. Now with the shadow, I'm not going to go in with the small detail brush at 10%, I'm just going to work with the 5% flow brush. And as I already mentioned, I'm going to emphasize the outer corner. So I might darken the lash line a little bit, and I might darken the crease. So here, once again, I highly encourage you to check out a couple of makeup tutorials to really understand what sort of makeup definition makes the eyes look more prominent and more flattering. We don't want to accidentally go against the makeup that the model is wearing and counteract it. So in this case, here's the before and the after for the shadow. And you see, even here, we sort of have this, top thing, then we have this middle thing and this lower thing. I don't know what to call them. They're parts of the three. Okay, the last thing that I might want to darken over here is going to be the top of the iris and perhaps the rim of the iris, but just very gently. So here's the before and the after. We're basically darkening the opposite of what we were highlighting. Okay, let's go and do the same thing with the other eye, and I'm going to speed through this as you've of course already seen this. I'll start out with the specular highlights, specifically working with a small brush. Then I'll also highlight the catch light and the opposite side on the iris. Lastly, I'll finish off the highlighting with the more subtle, large-scale highlights. Okay, let's move on to the shadow. Once again, we'll darken the crease, the bottom lash line, and the outer rim of the iris and the top of the iris. If we've gone too heavy on any of this, we can just pull up the mask view and carefully erase that part. Here's the before and after for this eye. Cool. So let's move on to some of the other features that we can define. One of them are the eyebrows, and since they're right here, we can go to those. Sometimes I like to fill in the eyebrows a little bit and define them, but this is really not something that I would recommend doing if you don't have any knowledge of makeup yet, because the eyebrows are extremely important. They really do frame the eyes and thus kind of the entire face, so I definitely wouldn't recommend winging it here. Also, I just noticed that this eyelash is bothering me down here, but fortunately, since we're working on non-destructive layers, I can easily come back into the cleanup layer and just fix this quickly. Cool. Moving on to the nose and the lips. So here, I also want to add a little bit of definition to the specular highlights, and I'm going to keep my flow at 5% for the highlight and the shadow. For the nose, I'm going to see where the brightest highlight is. If I need to turn on the assist, then I can use that to help me. I can even specify a little bit better, and this shows me that the brightest bit of it is really right here and then the tip of the nose. Okay, so I'm going to trace that with the highlight and carefully try to feather that out. I don't want to go too extreme here as this is already very bright. Same thing with the tip of the nose. want to emphasize the center of it and then carefully sort of feather out from there. Here's the before and the after. This might even already be too extreme, so I'm going to, oh, that's so cute! So I'm going to dial it back with an eraser. Okay, here's the before and the after. That's a little bit more subtle. So we can do a bit of the same thing with the shadow. I know we've already done it in more of the large scale contour, so here we can come in with a bit more of specific shape off to the sides of the nose, but we want to be very gentle here because otherwise we might accidentally give her a nose job, and, you know, while she might want that, she might not want that. Lastly, we can emphasize a couple more of the subtle highlights around the bottom of the nose, and this is really totally optional, very stylized decision, as it does sort of emphasize this bottom part of the nose, and this can either be very flattering or on some people it is not as flattering. Same thing with the shadow. Okay, here's the overall before and after for the nose. Lastly, let's take a look at the lips. Here we also have a couple of specular highlights, and we'll mostly find these around the Cupid's bow and the center of the lips. So I'll emphasize those first with a pretty small brush. We can even dial it back up to 10% if this is not fast enough for us. And then we can move on to a bit more large scale definition, so I'll just gently run this across the top of the Cupid's bow and the top of the lip, but only the side that the light is coming from, and then the center of the lip. Lastly, I'll finish off with a little bit of shadow. Here's the before and the after for the lips. So this is about it for the face. We'll recap this in just a second and make final adjustments, but I do want to add a little bit of shape to the hair as well. Here I like to dial up the flow to around 20% and start with the highlight, and to be honest, usually I won't even go into the shadow, I'll usually just stick to the highlight. So here I'm going to emphasize the brightest highlights and kind of go with the flow of the natural strands of hair. Personally, I try to keep this in smaller brush strokes, although I know some people prefer to just go in more generally, so that's definitely a stylistic choice. I'd say try both and see what you like. Okay, so here's the before and after for that hair. And once again, I usually don't go into the shadow and add that simply because usually the shadows are already deep enough in the hair and we don't really need to emphasize those. Maybe in lighter hair colors it would be a little bit more useful or appropriate. Okay, so at this point we can step back and evaluate our contour as a whole and see if we want to make any changes. So here's the before and the after. Now I do think it came in heavy in a couple of spots. We could choose to either dial back the overall opacity of the folder or remove it off of any areas that it feels too harsh on. In my case, I would say it comes in a little too strong around the temple and maybe the nose and maybe the eyes. I'm mostly looking at the shadow. The highlight seems pretty good to me. So, I'm going to select the mask of the shadow. That's kind of hilarious. Going to select the mask of the shadow and remove it a little bit off of the temple here. Just feather that a bit more and then slightly remove it off the nose and see if that looks a little bit better. Could remove it a little bit more off the temple maybe. And here's the before and the after. And that blends in a lot better. One more time, before and after. I'm going to go a little bit more subtle on the shadow around the eyes as well. Before and after. Okay, that feels a little bit better to me. One last time, before and after. Okay, so that's it for our contour. Now I just want to go over a little bit of troubleshooting before we conclude the chapter. I think often people struggle with the same kind of issues when contouring. It's generally all about smooth applications and really building those smooth transitions and shapes. Now I have an exercise that I really enjoy that I've attached to this download that you're welcome to try if you'd like. All it is this sphere, and it has a stencil and a dodge and a burn layer. So what we can do with these layers is use a paintbrush with white and with black on them, white on the dodge layer and burn on the black layer. And the instructions say to set it to 5% flow. And then the objective of this game is to create a sphere purely with dodge and burn. So here, of course, we want to, create the highest highlight and then feather from there in terms of our dodge. And we want to make sure that all of these, transitions are super smooth. This is obviously a sphere and not not a cube. So keep it smooth. And then you can come in with the burn, swap to the black brush, and bring in that shadow from the other side. And as you can see, I'm working with really, really large brushes here, and then singling down to a smaller brush to create the darkest shadows and the lightest highlights. But ultimately, the top priority is to keep everything super smooth. Some finishing touches on the dodge and a couple on the burn. And as you can see, this is only a 2-minute exercise, but it really, really helps you kind of gauge where you're at in terms of how smoothly you can create these transitions and shapes. Here's the before and here's the after. So we just made a shape from scratch, which we don't even need to do in contouring because fortunately we have, the face to adhere to. So it's a lot easier than this. My point is, if you can make a sphere, you can contour a face. I would highly recommend checking out this exercise. Generally, some other reasons why you might not have smooth applications and transitions might be that your flow might be too high, or you might have a hardware problem with your tablet, just as I said with local dodge and burn. Or you might just be contouring too heavily, in regards to the lighting situation. So in a high contrast lighting situation, we'll, want a decent amount of contour, but in super flat and soft light, heavy contour is not going to look that natural. So we will want to keep it, pretty subtle. Okay, so that concludes the contouring section, and we're about 90% through the retouch at this point, so we'll just finish up with a little bit of color correction.